So the number one thing that has been brought up in the comments about my tutorial series thus far has been the way I brushed over a lot of the wiring of the submarine. So if you saw the tutorial, you should recognize this sub, although a few textures have changed in recent updates. This is the one I built. I have removed all of the wiring from it, and I'm going to go through now and show you step by step how you wire the submarine. So, to start, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect our power grid up here in the junction room to the reactor. So I'm going to jump into wiring mode up at the top of the screen, and I'm going to grab a red wire. This is what I typically use to signify power. So we press E on the reactor, and we have its pinout. So we connect ourselves to power out, and then we're going to go up to this junction box in the upper left, and we're going to make this power in from the reactor. So now all that has to be done is this power needs to be snaked through the rest of the junction boxes. This is the most simple setup possible for your junction boxes. There are ways to make redundant systems with multiple power grids, but for right now I'm just keeping it simple. So I'm going to snake the power down here to the one right below it. I'm going to grab another cable and bring the power next door. And I'm going to continue like that in a serpentine pattern through the entire sub, or through the entire array of junction boxes. Oh, I didn't mean to quit out there. So other than the first and last junction box in our serpentine pattern, they should all have at least a fan out of 2 on their power pin. And we will end here. Now, there are a few things here that need to be given power still. If we hop out of wiring mode and move this wall over, this is where I hid the relay for the battery system that I went over last time. So the batteries need to receive power. So we can charge them off of this first junction box, so that they're always receiving power in when the grid is online. We want their power out to go to this relay so that we can determine whenever power is being inserted back into the grid. So power in on the relay is given the power out of our 2 main batteries. And then the relay component itself receives a signal. We're going to have it be toggle state, so that whenever a button on the nav terminal is pressed, the batteries, or the relay, will turn on or off, thus letting power through or not through. It starts off, so no signals will pass through the relay. So power initially will start out not being transmitted back into the grid. So we'll go to the nav terminal. If we scroll down, we can see what the tags are on the buttons. Label 1 is backup power array, so signal out 1 we will send to that relay component. Now the batteries from the relay need to inject back in to our power array, so we will just send that into this next junction box in the cycle. The junction boxes have a max fan out of 5, meaning we can have 5 pins connected to a single thing. So we have one more pin here that we can use for power. So we will hook up a wire, and we'll do a single light on the ship as an example. There is a light right here down in the med bay, so we'll press E on the light, and we just connect the power. Now at this point, wires are starting to get a little messy, so I'm going to take a minute to organize them. So we press Control and click to add a node to our wire, which we can now drag. And we already have cable holders run from when we did the aesthetic portion of the ship. So just following the pattern of cable holders, we can arrange the wire so that it's not quite all over the place. Right, like that. If we hop out of wiring mode, we can move this wall back into place, hop back into wiring mode, and we know what we need to move. So we can add nodes to hide all this wiring in the walls where it should ideally never be seen. We'll make sure our signal wire to the nav terminal routes properly through the holders. All the way across to the nav terminal. Right here. There's no vertical cable holder here yet because the texture on the nav terminal changed. You didn't need one before. So if you need to add one, you can go down to the Entity menu, search Cable, and find Cable Holder Vertical. And then we can move the nav terminal, use the arrow keys to pop that into place, and put the nav terminal back. And there we go. So, other devices on the ship that need power. These supercapacitors. It's a good idea to make sure that your supercapacitors are being fed from different junction boxes, so that one junction box breaking doesn't keep your guns from receiving power. So I'm going to do the top two from this box and the bottom two from this box. So simply power on the junction box goes to power in on the supercap. We will wire this one as well. And then these two supercapacitors here. Perfect. So the supercapacitors will provide power to the guns, but we'll do those later. So other devices that need power, the engines. So we can grab this junction box has a complete fan out of 5, so we'll go down to the next one, which can hold 2 more items. So we'll send power from here down to our large engine, and we'll send the other power from here to our deconstructor. The fabricator also needs power, so we'll feed it power from the next junction box, which we will also have feed into the oxygen generator, and perhaps the nav terminal. The status monitor is going to need power, even though it is linked to the main nav terminal. So we'll feed that from the next one. Our small pumps, the bilge pumps, and our ballast pumps are also going to need power, so we'll start wiring those. So we have 2 more fan outs here. We'll send one of them down to this pump and to this pump. With the next box, we will start wiring up the ballast pumps. Again, it can be a good idea to spread these out across different junction boxes to keep one junction box failure from taking out all of your ability to control the ship's ascent and descent. So I'm going to power each one off of a different junction box. You have to remember that because of the way we wired in a serpentine pattern from the reactor, if this first one breaks and there's no longer power coming in from the reactor, then we can have the backup array inject in here. If this one breaks, it interrupts all the rest. Like I said before, there are ways to wire up redundant systems, but other people have already done tutorials on that, and I'm just giving an example of how to do the basic wiring. So I will power this bilge pump from this junction box, which has 1 more fan out. So we will send this power down to the medical fabricator, and we'll send the last 2 fan outs on this one to the periscopes, which are on the front of the ship. Alright, so now we will start wiring up the guns. The guns receive power from the supercapacitor. The reason for that is the guns are going to take large bursts of energy to fire, the railgun in particular. So the supercapacitor is able to quickly charge and then release large bursts of energy. It has a lower capacity than something like a battery, but it has a much higher output. Trying to wire the guns directly to the junction box would cause voltage drops every single time you fire a gun, and you can bring your grid down that way. Or possibly send the reactor into meltdown. So, we'll send the power out on this cap to this gun. We'll wire this one to this gun here. Each gun does not necessarily need a separate supercapacitor. You can run all of your guns off of one, or you can run 2 guns off of one. You just have to pay attention to how quickly those capacitors are draining when you're in a firefight, and determine whether or not you need to add more from there. This ship is also equipped with discharge coils, I believe right here. So the way the discharge coil works is it will drain the supercapacitor in one electrical burst that will create a small electrical field here that stuns small enemies. So I will connect that up to this top right supercapacitor. You have to be aware that using that coil will cause this capacitor to discharge completely, and it'll have to charge again before the gun it's connected to can fire. Okay, that is pretty much the basics of all of the power requirements on the ship. Obviously there are other lights that I'm not wiring up right now, but I did show how to do one. For emergency lights, by default the emergency lights are always on. They do not require power. You can determine that here with there's a checkbox for whether or not it is on, and then there is an entry down here for power consumption. If you set your power consumption to 0 and check the is on light, the light will turn on whether or not it is receiving power from the reactor, which is good for emergency lights and external lights on the outside of the hull. So now let's talk about signal wiring. The nav terminal needs to be connected to a couple of things, such as the ballast pumps and the large engine. So we'll start with the engine, which provides us our X motion. So we'll jump into wiring mode, and we'll grab a blue cable this time for signal. And we will wire its velocity X out, which is horizontal motion, over to the set force on our engine. Now we need to assign the velocity Y out to all 3 ballast pumps so that they can fill and empty the ship as needed. So we set that to the set speed pin on the ballast pumps, and that's wiring back to this velocity Y out. And we do that with all 3 ballast pumps. Set speed. If we scroll back down to our signals, we can see we have 2 more. We have signal out 2 and signal out 3 that still need wired. We can see label 2 I had set as activate discharge coils. So we will take signal 2 down to the discharge coil and set it to trigger in, so that when that button is pressed, it will trigger the coil. And the last one here is set to signal out 3. Or the last one here is signal out 3, which is set to reactor shutdown. So we can grab that signal, bring it to our reactor, and wire it to shut down. That way, whenever that button is pressed, the reactor will shut itself down completely. It'll go into scram. So we need to wire our guns up to their periscopes. So this periscope here is for the, let's view this text entry. It's for the Ventral Coil Gun, which is the bottom coil gun in back here. So we have 2 wires that we need to run to that, position and trigger. Position out on the periscope. We'll go to position in on the gun, and similarly trigger in on the gun. We'll go to trigger out on the periscope, and that's that gun wired up. We have the rear coil gun. This will be the rear dorsal coil gun, so up on the top back here. We wire up position, and then trigger. And the same thing with our last coil gun. Position and trigger. So the last gun is our railgun. The railgun loader is in its own gunnery compartment down below the main gunnery compartment. So we'll wire it to that periscope. And that is it for gun signal wiring. We still need these periscopes. We still need these searchlights to go to periscopes. So we wire position out on this periscope to position in on the searchlight. And if you want to be able to turn the searchlights on and off from the periscope, you can set the trigger out on the periscope to toggle state on the searchlight. That way, whenever you click in the periscope view, it will turn the light on and off. And we'll wire up the ventral searchlight and toggle state back to trigger out. You may have seen spots for water data in and oxygen data in on the status monitor. It is not necessary to set those because we have the nav terminal set to not require them. If you scroll down in the status monitor, you will see require water detectors and require oxygen detectors. If it was the case that you had these boxes checked, then on the status monitor you would not get oxygen or water data for the different compartments unless you had oxygen and water detectors, and those would simply wire back to these pins. I don't use them typically for the submarines I use because my friends and I tend to play at a more casual level. So the last thing we need to do is wire up the docking hatch. On the docking hatch, the last two AND components on the bottom and top both need to be wired to toggle docking on the nav terminal. So we will grab a blue signal wire for signal in 1 and take it down to the nav terminal's toggle docking. And we also need toggle docking to go out to the other AND components signal in 1. Once that's done, you can put your whole piece back into place. Whenever you move a whole piece, or a shell piece rather, and you go into wiring mode and you come back, if you want to put it back quickly, you can select it and hit Control Z for undo on your keyboard, and it'll snap back to its last known position. And with that, the wiring for the ship is basically complete. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to direct them to the comments below, and thank you for watching.